The Motley Theatre Group is visiting this weekend, and it's important that they're here because it's part of a valiant effort on the part of Ranga Shankara to bring back the audiences after several months of having closed the theatre due to the pandemic. Naseeruddin Shah, the founder of Motley Theatre Group, is with us for a conversation. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Before we begin speaking about Ismat Chugtai, whose stories are part of your
Repertoire,
performance
yes.
this afternoon, do you have a sense for what the audience is going offline or online has meant for performance arts in India?
It has given me an insight into which I should have absorbed a long time ago, and which is that you can't afford to concentrate on the audience when you're performing. By that I don't mean you're oblivious to them, but you can't let their reactions guide your performance. And performing online was a terrific lesson, not only for me, but as I pointed out to many other actors in my team, that irrespective of whether you get a laugh or you get a silence at the right moment or a gasp or a applause or anything of the sort, your performance must not dip in its intensity, and it should not dip in your attempt to get across. And you have to be oblivious and aware of the audience at the same time, and I don't deny that having an audience present is certainly more helpful to an actor. But I think that he should retain the same desire to communicate even if there's no one present, because sooner or later someone would be. So it's getting closer to communicating with the camera, which is more film work, and I think it's inevitable. I just wish that we can find more creative ways of filming plays and presenting them, because I find the stuff that is shown on television in the name of theatre, these recorded plays, some of which are wonderful plays, some of the best plays written in the 70s in India, done in terrible presentations. And it is very heartening to see the number of people who are coming back to the theatre, even though Prithvi Theatre in Mumbai only allows in 100 people. Ranga Shankara is also going to be playing to half capacity. But it just indicates that people have missed the theatre. They haven't missed movies because they could see all the movies they wanted to online. And as for me, I'm just overjoyed to be back on the stage. There are few things in life I love more than the stage. There's nothing in life which I owe more to, and where I have the greatest amount of fun. But performing online, even for theatre actors, may be an inevitable part of the future. That's what I feel.
And that might have a bearing on what acting means, stage acting means.
It will. It certainly will, because it's not an immediate transmission of energies that is happening via the camera. When a live audience is present, it's an exchange of energies. It's more than the applause and the instant reaction and everything. It's the vibe you exchange with the audience and the unity you feel with the audience. That is something that we'll have to learn to live without performing online. Just like we've learned to live with mobile phones going off in the middle of a performance.
You mentioned that you met Ismat Chugtai on the sets of Junoon in the late 70s. Mm-hmm. But you actually came across a book of her stories 20 years later.
Yes.
In the late 90s in a Bangalore
after
bookstore.
She died, yeah.
And you reached out for, translations were bad, then you reached out for the original, and then you felt to you that you must adapt them into theatre.
Yes.
What did you find attractive about her stories?
Every character that she writes about reverberates, resonates with me. She's writing about the same kind of people my family belongs to. A small town in UP, middle class, once land-owning, now gradually seeing their glory fading. She often writes about people like that. She writes with equal compassion about a sweeper girl, a person who tills the land, a pimp, an unreasonable husband, and so on. But not only was the fact that I could recognize all these characters almost as part of my extended family, but the compassion with which she presents these people. She never passes judgment on them. She has a terrific turn of phrase, laser-like observation of relationships, and a wicked sense of humor. And I never get tired of reading her stories. I don't know how many hundreds she's written. I have a book, a compilation of 100 stories. I haven't read them all, but there's not a single one I've read which I felt, yeah, it's okay. Now, every one of those I just felt completely mesmerized by. And she was often, I wouldn't say accused, but criticized by committed people like the poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who was an activist and a trade union worker and worked for the postal workers and so on, was actually out in the field, and whose poetry is all concerned with political issues, even though it may have the veneer of a romantic poem. And she was taken to task somewhat for not writing about more important issues than just human foibles. Maybe the criticism is valid, maybe it isn't. I'm not an authority on her, but her own response was that I don't know the farmer and the mill worker so well to be able to write about them. I write about what I know, and what she knew. It's her way of telling a story is just so utterly fascinating. And I realized also that, because people did ask, well, is this theatre? Is this theatrical? And this word theatrical, to me, it offends me because it implies something which is larger than life, and where actors are acting like this all the time. To me, theatre is something where people assemble. The word theatre itself means meeting point, where people assemble to exchange ideas, where you talk and other people listen, as in the case of the professional theatre. And to get across to them is, to me, the greatest achievement, whatever the material may be. It's not as if I'm against political theatre, but I'm against pamphleteering in the theatre, and I'm against preaching. And Ismat Abba doesn't do either of these things. It also made me aware of the fact that in a storytelling, you use only the essentials. Theatre is a story, whether it's Shakespeare or Shaw, anybody, or if anything, it's a story ultimately. So we don't enact the story, we narrate the story, and we found it gains acceptance. And we strip the stage of everything that isn't essential. There's nothing on the stage for decoration. There's nothing on stage for visual effect. I don't believe that the audience should applaud an empty stage because it has a grand set. That's nonsense to my mind. You should have on stage only that which is essential and only that which is used. And it also made me aware of what Brecht was trying to say. Something I was taught in drama school and didn't make any sense to me. How can an actor be alienated from the performance he's playing? I always believed that no, I have to feel like a postman if I'm playing a postman. I've got to feel like a beggar if I'm playing a beggar. What Brecht said, you have to represent these characters. You don't become them. The performances of storytelling have been a great lesson in that, and I think that is a very valid form of theatre, perhaps the only valid form. I detest this whole business of making a big mystery around the play, of having the actors hide away and silence and this mood music playing and a purple light, and the audience says, oh my, what's going to happen? I don't know. So you should break that stupid fourth wall, because it breaks the ice between you and the audience as well. You need them on the same page.
In terms of the story, Chukta story is posing a particular challenge for adaptation. In the story you're performing this afternoon, Garwali, I reread it last night, and it is fast-paced, and the metaphors are all exaggerated.
Yeah.
And the realism is of a fantastic kind. and it's not leaving you time to, catch your breath. It's things like that, formal properties of her writing. And I saw that in 3 or 4 more stories of hers, that there's a pace there. She's leaving you no time for taking a break. I mean, it's such things. And what did that mean for adaptation?
I haven't really adapted the stories. We tell the story exactly as it's written. The one person tells the story, the other characters don't appear, nor are the incidents enacted. That was the challenge. And in fact, I never even considered making Gharwali into a play, because the woman who is the pivot of Gharwali, this gorgeous creature called Lajo, I don't think there is an actor in the world who can act her, She has to be left to the imagination, because she's so amazing, amazingly splendid in her ways, and so beautiful and charming and defiant and everything about. I mean, you have to, even if you get a houri from heaven, she wouldn't be good enough, because nothing can match your imagination. And that's another important lesson I learned, that I've always believed that the theatre should not attempt to create illusion like cinema creates. This is something I learned from Grotowski, who I also worked with for a while. It's futile trying to create cinematic illusion on stage. So one must look for theatrical techniques to stimulate the audience's imagination. That's the theatre's job, not to show forest fires and floods and ships crossing the stage.
Isma Chugta is very usual for people to slaughter as a progressive writer, as movement person, and as a feminist writer, etc. But these labels like this often tend to hide the very distinctive sort of virtues that a writer usually has.
Yeah.
In Chugta's case, what elements do you think may have escaped attention as a result of having slaughtered her like this?
Yeah, her humanism. The fact that she's a feminist I don't think it's a misnomer, because she's not a bra burner or anything of the sort. She doesn't detest men, and she doesn't curse them or anything. Her take on men is a very amused kind of a take, at the foibles and the foolishness of men. She and her craft as a story writer. That's what no one seems to notice, because the stories themselves are so good, you get wrapped up in the story, and you don't worry about how the writer worked this magic on you, that you just could not put the story down until you had finished it. That is all to do with craft. However much warmth or compassion or heart or humor you may have, unless you've got the craft, and she has it, the way O. Henry had it, and she was very much influenced by O. Henry. Apparently, was one of her favorite writers. Somerset Maugham and O. Henry were her favorite writers, and she also had read Shaw. Her knowledge of English literature was quite incredible. Even though I never ever heard her speak in English, she always spoke in Urdu. But she obviously her English was also very good. She never spoke in the language. The fact that she was so much other than a writer, she became famous because her writings were labeled obscene. It was a double-edged sword. Maybe it was a blessing that everybody got to hear of Isma Chugta. I even as a child heard, hey, this bloody woman, she writes filthy stuff, Not from my mother, who would also read her stories, but from other male members of the family. And what in fact she was doing, which is something I do talk about in the introduction today, is that it was her challenges hurled at patriarchy, at outmoded rituals, and at the thekedars of religion. That's who she was lampooning. And that's what these guys couldn't stand. The charges of obscenity were pure hogwash to cover their real intentions, They wanted to silence her. They didn't want a woman saying these things. and they were not offended by the sexual, and all her stories are mighty lusty. That was not the problem. The problem was her lampooning of the male domination and the institutionalization of patriarchy, and these people who've taken it upon themselves to issue fatwas or whatever, to other people who will control your mind.
She is clearly opposed to patriarchy, yet at the same time she is compassionate and she lacks an aggression towards males, something that you mentioned.
Yes.
You also said there's an amusement towards male domination. So all of these put together, what kind of a quality to the give to her dissent? As a modern writer.
Quality too?
To her dissent, her political dissent.
Yeah. Why? I think that if you want to make a statement which you want it should penetrate, you got to hold the listener's attention first of all, and that's what she does. Being pedantic and being too philosophical and being too intellectual doesn't work in such situations. It is really unfortunate that her work wasn't read by the people who needed to read it, by the housewives, by the women who worked in the kitchen, by the sweeperesses, by the mehndi walis, the sabzi, etc., etc. These were the people she was writing about. So in a sense, she was preaching to the converted or preaching to those who objected, not to those to whom these stories would have really, really meant something and may have affected them in some way.
You've told us that she's written hundreds of stories. You can't put a clear number to it even.
Yeah.
And your theatre group has adapted several of her stories under this Ismat Apa Ke Naam. When you look back, do you see a kind of logic behind why those stories seemed particularly suited of all the stories, that all of which were compelling for you?
Because all of them, I hate the word relevant, but it's the fact that all of them, all the things she talks about still happen today. There's a story about, in today's show, of her witnessing a childbirth, a peasant girl giving birth to a baby on a train. This has happened at least thrice on local trains in Bombay. The second story is about a man who abandons his wife on the night of the marriage, and we know a few people who've done that. And the third one is a satire on marriage, which still absolutely resonates even today, where once you get into wedlock, it just changes the equation about everything. And thus she has similar stories about a British officer, which is part of the one I'm planning next. It's called Hindustan Chhod Do. A British officer who falls in love with a prostitute and refuses to leave when the British leave, and ends up dying a beggar on the street. These are the kind of stories which may not have any political significance, but to me are heart-rending accounts of humans, and to me that is what matters most.
Yes, it does have a political relevance in the sense to explain the absence of hate for the British. Big stories like this.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, she doesn't pass judgment on this guy. Though she mentions, he did this and he did that and he did that, and I should have hated him, but it broke my heart to see his condition.
You've you performed her stories for more than a decade now.
Yeah, 2 decades.
2 decades. Yeah. And in your repeated engagements, have newer dimensions become visible?
Absolutely, because it's quite astounding. 20 years, 2001 we first did this play, as a play, and we must have done 500 performances of it by now. We thought we were pretty good when we started it, because the audience liked it. But as you go on and on, it's like an object lesson in how much work an actor should do. We just keep finding more. in each of the stories. Over 20 years, I don't think too many actors get an opportunity to rehearse the same play over 20 years. So we're very, very lucky over there. But it gives rise to a disturbing thought that maybe this over 20 years, the amount of work we've done is what we should have done in the first place. But that is the test of any great writing, I feel, that it reveals itself to you gradually. It reveals itself to you the more you engage with it. And the performances, the structure of the performances has stayed the same. There is just a lot more understanding on our own parts as storytellers and as people who are trying to get a piece of writing across.
Just during this conversation, I get a sense that tradition is something that matters to you. Not just in the sense of a theatre tradition to which you clearly belong and you've contributed to, but in the sense of what you feel is worth passing on to new audiences, new generations. And these stories, I think, reflect a certain attitude perhaps on your part towards how one positions oneself towards the past and the future. Just the way that. So I'm just wondering if.
I think that is unwitting because I don't attach that much importance to my work as to consider it to be a passing on to the next generation. But the fact is, I think you're right about what you said about tradition, that I have a deep regard for it because we are what we are because of the traditions. Not to flatter myself, but this wonderful bunch of young actors that we have today in cinema. There's too many to name. They're all quite wonderful. Starting with someone like Irfan, who's now no longer with us. They are there because actors like Om and Shabana and Smita and myself and Deepthi and Farooq Sheikh were in the generation before them, and we were there only because actors like Balraj Sahni and Motilal and Soumitra Chatterjee or other great actors from the South who I'm not terribly familiar with were already around. The tradition continued, and then those people were the first of their kind, the generation before us. We were the follow-through of that tradition, and the present actors are a follow-through of ours. So I think you can't be so much conscious about your role in history,
If you can look back in the last 20 years, not at the moment of doing it, but now you've been doing it for 20 years. If you look back, do you see some shared overlap in concerns of yours as to why you've been attached to these stories and the audience response is nudging you in a certain way, perhaps?
The audience response, a lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that they seem to hold me in high regard. And I think that they forgive lapses on my part, and that's generous of them, that they forget the bad work I've done and remember the good one. But I've done my share of bad work as well in cinema. But I think that you do what you feel impelled to do, and you draw upon what's gone before you to move you further. I'm not the first one to start doing stories on stage. Satyadev Dubey did them years before I did. So it was his example. If I hadn't had that example, maybe I wouldn't have attempted doing stories on stage. And then it harks back to the traditions of storytelling which have been part of our thousands of years of lore, of tradition, where you have people who recite the Mahabharata all night. You had the Dastan Gos who recited these stories of Amir Hamza, and you have the Marsiyas, and you have this. It's all performance. So somewhere I think, enriched and limited at the same time by my genetic, my family tree. That we haven't had any actors in my family, though there are plenty of guys who should have become actors, but didn't. We had the most fascinating characters. I could draw upon them. They drew upon their predecessors, and so on. So, I don't know if that answers your question,
It
but...
answers my question.
But
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Look forward to your performance in the afternoon.
It's an absolute pleasure to be back, and I'm so happy to see so many of the audience coming back to the theatres. Keep your masks on and keep your distance. Play safe.